He had everything: wisdom that commanded the reverence of kings, wealth that transformed distant queens into pilgrims, peace that stretched unmolested across every national boundary. He spoke with God face to face, not once, but on two separate, miraculous occasions. He erected a house of worship so sacred that heaven itself physically descended into it, so heavy with glory that robust, grown men could not remain standing. And yet, Solomon died searching, not for answers to philosophical riddles, not for more gold, nor for another throne. He was desperately searching for meaning, the one essential commodity all his legendary wisdom failed utterly to deliver. How does this profound paradox occur? How does the wisest man in the entire history of the world become the loneliest man before his final breath? How does a man who oversaw the construction of the temple, where the very presence of God dwelled, end up building altars dedicated to demons on the high hills just outside Jerusalem? Today, we are going to walk through the untold narrative of Solomon's final days. Not the polished, sanitized version you might have heard in Sunday school, but the raw, unfiltered truth concealed within the ancient scriptures. We will trace the slow drift that began with political expediency, diplomacy, the profound fall initiated by small compromises, the altars he never should have raised, and the resulting silence of God that followed the division of his once devoted heart. But here is what makes this story so urgent for us today. Before Solomon took his last breath, he penned something, a final warning, a confession wrapped in profound poetry. And if you are currently chasing the phantom of success, managing moral compromise in the shadows, or feeling that slow separation from the God who once felt palpable and close, his last words might be the critical turning point you didn't even realize you desperately needed. Because this is not just an account of Solomon's collapse. It is a detailed map of how every heart blessed abundantly by God can slowly lose its way. How prosperity can become an gilded cage, a luxurious prison. How profound wisdom, unaccompanied by constant obedience, turns into decorated emptiness. And how one final, crushing sentence, written in the twilight of a broken king's life, could bring you back before it's tragically too late. What you are about to hear may permanently alter your perception of wisdom itself. Solomon inherited the throne far too young, he thought. His father, David, the giant slayer, the warrior king, the man after God's own heart, had left behind a legacy, a pair of shoes no son could possibly fill. And Solomon knew this intimately. The weight of the crown pressed down on him heavier than pure gold. Israel faced threats on every border. The people expected overwhelming strength. The elders demanded peerless wisdom. And Solomon, he felt like a mere child standing awkwardly in his father's massive armor, crushed by expectations he was certain to fail. So he went to Gibeon, not accompanied by armies or counselors, but with 1,000 burnt offerings, the smoke rising like desperate prayers into a boundless sky that seemed indifferent to his need. He came trembling, deeply humbled, painfully aware of how small he was beneath the burden of a crown meant for someone so much stronger. That night, God appeared to him in a dream. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. Imagine the magnitude of that moment. The creator of the universe standing before a young, untested king, offering him a cosmic blank check, anything. Power to crush every enemy, wealth beyond human measure, a long life stretching into legend, fame that would eclipse all empires. But Solomon did not ask for any of that. He said, I am but a fledgling, a mere child, and I am lost as to how to fulfill these awesome duties. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish clearly between right and wrong. For who is capable of governing this great people of yours? 1 Kings 3 verses 5-9. The heavens must have rejoiced, because in that moment Solomon understood a fundamental truth most men never grasp. That true strength resides not in amassed possessions, but in the recognition of one's own desperate need for something greater than oneself. And God answered, not just with wisdom, but lavishly with everything Solomon had not asked for. Riches no king had ever accumulated. Honor that would make powerful nations tremble. a name that would echo through millennia. But here is the profound truth we often miss. The greatest wisdom is not knowing everything. It is knowing that you need God. Solomon understood that once, there in the darkness at Gibeon, humbled and brutally honest. He got it perfectly right. But the very gift that propelled him to greatness would later become the precise factor that exposed his vulnerability. Because wisdom without continued surrender to God's authority becomes the seed of destructive pride. It didn't take long for that wisdom to be tested on the global stage. Two women stood before the throne, both claiming ownership of the same infant child, both insisting they were the rightful mother. No witnesses, no material evidence, simply two voices, both equally shrill with desperate conviction, and a baby too young to speak on his own behalf. The court fell into a heavy silence. Every eye fixed upon the young king. This was impossible. How do you arbitrate a case where truth seemed to have vanished without a trace? Where emotional claims ran just as high on both conflicting sides? Where justice appeared to have no logical foothold? The elders waited expectantly. The advisors watched intently. The people held their collective breath. Solomon sat still for a long moment. Then he spoke, "Bring me a sword." The entire room froze instantly. "Cut the living child in two," he ordered, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady, utterly devoid of hesitation. "Give half to one woman and half to the other." One woman nodded quickly, her face hard, her profound grief twisted into bitter malice. "Neither of us will have him then. Let the baby be divided." But the other woman screamed, her voice a raw, breaking roar of desperation. "No, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Just do not kill him. Let him live." Solomon lifted his hand. "Give the living baby to the woman who pleaded for his life. She is absolutely his mother." The courtroom erupted, not in confusion, but in profound awe, because they had just witnessed something far beyond mere cleverness. This was not legal genius or psychological trickery. This was divine discernment flowing effortlessly through a man who had completely yielded himself to God. 1 Kings 3 verse 28 says, "All Israel held the king in awe, because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice." The wisdom of God, not Solomon's sharp intellect, not his rigorous training or his human cunning. God himself speaking through a yielded heart, revealing truth where human reason had no possible path. But every test reveals both the strength of a man and, subtly, the seed of his weakness. And Solomon's weakness would not come from an enemy outside the palace walls. It would emerge from within. Solomon harbored one dream greater than the ambition of his own throne, to build a permanent, glorious house for God. His father David had passionately desired it, planned it meticulously, and gathered the raw materials, spending years collecting the finest cedar and gold and precious stones. But God told him no. A warrior's hands, stained with the grim reality of perpetual battle, could not raise the temple. That unparalleled honor would belong to his son, the designated man of peace. So Solomon built it. 7 long years of tireless labor, the finest cedar from Lebanon hauled across forbidding mountains, pure gold overlaying every surface until the walls blazed like captured sunlight. Carved cherubim stretched their massive wings across the Holy of Holies, their faces eternally turned toward the mercy seat. Stones were cut with such flawless precision in the distant quarries that they married perfectly together in absolute silence. No hammer, no chisel dared to disturb the sacred work as the temple slowly rose. And when it was finally finished, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the innermost chamber. The same Ark that had led Israel through the wilderness, the same divine presence that had shaken mountains at Sinai and parted seas before Moses. The mercy seat where God had promised to meet his people. Solomon stood before the gathered nation and prayed, his voice steady, his heart open, his hands lifted high toward heaven. "Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way." 1 Kings 8 verse 23. And then it happened. The glory of God descended. Not gently, not quietly, not as a whisper or a breeze. It came as a cloud, overwhelmingly dense, filling every recess of the sacred space with a weight of holiness that physically incapacitated the priests. They collapsed under it, trembling, spiritually undone, weeping, because heaven had touched earth, and no man could remain upright in the presence of perfect holiness. This was Israel's highest moment, the pinnacle of their corporate faith, the generation that saw God transition from tabernacle to temple, from wandering to settled dwelling, from abstract promise to tangible fulfillment. The people wept, the priests worshipped, and Solomon must have felt in that moment that nothing could ever go wrong again. But here is the truth we often forget. Even divine glory can fade when constant gratitude disappears. The man who brought heaven to earth would eventually raise altars to his rivals. The world had never witnessed anything like the prosperity that followed. Gold poured into Jerusalem like an inexhaustible stream. 666 talents annually, a figure that would ironically echo later in prophecy. But in Solomon's day, it was simply abundance. Unimaginable, relentless, almost obscene abundance. Ships arrived from distant shores carrying ivory, exotic apes, and peacocks, treasures Israel had never dreamed of. Traders brought spices that saturated the streets with fragrance. Merchants came with fine silk, jewels, and rare woods carved by foreign artisans. The throne itself was an unparalleled work of art, carved from pure ivory and overlaid completely with pure gold. 6 ascending steps led up to it. Lions stood guard on every level, their eyes appearing to watch everyone who approached. Everything Solomon touched seemed to turn to gold, often literally. And then she came, the Queen of Sheba. She had heard the persistent rumors carried by traders across vast deserts and dangerous seas. A king whose wisdom surpassed all legend. A kingdom where justice flowed like a perpetual river and profound peace settled like morning dew. Where even the servants moved with an air of dignity and the poorest citizen lived without fear. So she journeyed, with camels groaning under the weight of spices, gold, and precious stones, simply to verify if the stories were remotely true. They were. 1 Kings 10 verses 6 to 7. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. She stood in his courts and observed the order, the sheer beauty, the reverence woven into the very fabric of daily life. She watched servants moving with discernible purpose, heard wisdom falling from his lips like refreshing rain, and felt the undeniable presence of something sacred in every stone and song. She listened to his answers and realized her own complex questions were revealed to be far too rudimentary. She watched his kingdom function and understood that hers was broken. She left breathless, fundamentally changed, convinced she had witnessed something divine. And she was right, for a moment. But here is the tragedy we miss in the middle of all that gold. The kingdom shone, but the king's core heart had already begun to tarnish. Because abundance without obedience doesn't remain a blessing for long. It becomes a weight, an ever-present distraction, and eventually a prison disguised as a glorious palace. Solomon was a politician as much as he was a king. And in his geopolitical world, lasting peace required more than abstract wisdom. It demanded alliances, treaties signed in blood and ink, marriages that sealed borders and preemptively silenced enemies before they could rise up. So he married the daughter of Pharaoh, a brilliant political masterstroke. Egypt, the ancient enemy, was now bound by familial ties. Then came a woman from Moab, another from Sidon, one from Ammon, one after another. Each union was a strategic move, each winning a diplomatic victory, each alliance another guaranteed layer of peace. It made perfect political sense. It worked. The borders stayed quiet. The major wars never came. And surely, Solomon thought, a man endowed with the very wisdom of God could navigate this political tightrope. He wasn't some weak-willed fool who would let women turn his heart. He was Solomon, the wisest man alive. But God had already spoken definitively about this. Deuteronomy 17 verse 17 states, "The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray." Not might be led astray. Not could be under certain conditions. The text confirms, will be. It was not a suggestion left open for interpretation. It was a warning carved into the law long before Solomon was born, written by Moses, breathed by God himself. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the rationalizations, Solomon knew it. But wisdom, when it turns inward and stops submitting to God, has a dangerous way of rewriting clear obedience into self-granted permission. I can handle this, he must have told himself in the quiet moments. I'm not like other men. My heart is established. I know the crucial difference between a necessary alliance and destructive compromise. I can honor their cultural frameworks without embracing their deities. I can love these women without losing myself. But compromise doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It doesn't march through the front gate waving a warning banner. It slips in quietly, cloaked in the guise of reason, speaking the smooth language of wisdom. The palace began to change, slowly, subtly. Incense from foreign altars drifted through the courtyards. Just small offerings, nothing major. Mere gestures of respect for his wife's deeply held traditions. Statues that should never have been allowed past the gates were given places of honor, tucked into corners at first, small ones explained away as diplomatic courtesy. Every treaty demanded silence about something sacred. Every marriage required tolerance of something God had strictly forbidden. And Solomon, the man who once prayed only for discernment, began to fatally confuse tolerance with true understanding, compromise with compassion. The drift had begun, not with an open fall, not with blatant rebellion, but just with one compromise, and then another, until the space between his heart and God's voice grew wider than he realized. And then came the altars. 1 Kings 11 verses 4-8. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Not fully devoted, not completely gone, not overtly worshiping demons in the dark, just divided. He didn't abandon God entirely. He didn't tear down the temple or halt the sacrifices. He simply made room for others, created sacred space for gods who had no right to breathe Jerusalem's air. Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, whose worship was steeped in sensuality, temple prostitution, and rituals that degraded everything God called sacred about intimacy and covenant. Chemosh, the god of Moab, an idol of ruthless power and national pride, demanding loyalty that belonged solely to Yahweh. And Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, a bronze statue with outstretched arms, heated from beneath until those arms glowed a terrible, molten red. Parents would lay their infants there as burnt offerings, drums pounding frantically to drown out the screams, priests chanting while children burned. Solomon built high places for them, not in secret, not hidden in caves or behind locked doors. On the hills east of Jerusalem, in full view of the magnificent temple he had built for God. Stone altars rising into the sky like glaring monuments to profound betrayal. The same hands that had once lifted the Ark of the Covenant, trembling, reverent, holy, now raised stones for demons. Let that terrible irony settle for a moment. The man who once made heaven descend into the temple was now giving hell a seat at the royal table. The people watched, and what the king permitted, the nation quickly embraced. What he tolerated, they normalized. The altars on the hills became established gathering places. The songs once sung only to Yahweh were now mingled with chants to gods whose worship demanded shame and blood. Mothers who once taught their children about the Exodus now whispered prayers to Ashtoreth. Fathers who once feared the Lord now burned incense to Chemosh for success in business. And through it all, the temple still stood. Its gold still gleamed fiercely in the sun. The priests still offered sacrifices. The rituals continued mechanically. But God, who had once filled that house with glory so thick men could not stand, was now utterly silent. The voice that spoke so clearly at Gibeon, quiet. The presence that descended at the dedication, withdrawn. Solomon wore the crown, but heaven had left the building. God had appeared to Solomon twice. Twice. That alone should tell you something monumental. In all of Scripture, there are only a handful of people God spoke to more than once in visible, undeniable form. Moses at the burning bush and on Sinai, Abraham under the oaks and on the mountain, and Solomon, once at Gibeon and once after the temple was complete. The first time at Gibeon, God came with grace, with abundant blessing, with a gift that would define a generation and echo through history. But the second time was profoundly different. 1 Kings 9 verses 6-7. God's voice, no longer resonating with boundless grace, no longer inviting and generous, was instead measured, warning. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. It wasn't a threat meant to manipulate. It was a forecast, a merciful warning wrapped in the language of grief. Like a father watching his son drift toward a perilous precipice, shouting one final, merciful warning before the edge, God was giving him a chance, one final opportunity to turn back, to remember who he was, to choose obedience before the consequences became tragically irreversible. But Solomon didn't turn. He heard the words. He must have felt the weight of them pressing on his chest. Maybe he even promised himself he would change, made quiet resolutions in the middle of sleepless nights. But his heart had grown too accustomed to the comfort of compromise, too entangled in the political alliances, too assured in his own ability to manage what God had already forbidden. Wisdom had become his idol. And idols always promise seductive control while they slowly but surely steal your soul. And so the voice that once called him beloved fell silent. Not because God abandoned him. God never abandons his people first. But because Solomon had stopped listening. The noise of 1,000 voices, wives, advisors, foreign priests, political pressures, had drowned out the one voice that mattered supremely. Even divine warnings lose their sound when the human heart closes its ears. The crown was still on his head. The kingdom still obeyed his decrees. The tributes still poured in. But heaven had withdrawn its favor. And the man who once walked in the intimate counsel of God now walked alone, surrounded by people, but isolated in spirit, powerful, yet profoundly empty. Judgment came, but not in the way Solomon expected. It didn't arrive through overwhelming war. No foreign army stormed the gates. It didn't come through plague or famine or some dramatic cosmic sign. It came through a prophet, a humble piece of cloth, and a man Solomon thought he could trust. Ahijah the Shilonite met a young man named Jeroboam on the road outside Jerusalem. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's capable officials, strong, fiercely loyal, ambitious, a man with leadership visibly written into his very bones. He had served the king well, managed major projects, earned widespread respect, and God had chosen him for something Solomon would never see coming. Ahijah was wearing a brand new cloak. Without a word of explanation, he took it off, gripped it with both hands, and tore it into 12 pieces. The sound of tearing fabric broke the silence. Then he handed 10 pieces to Jeroboam. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, see, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen, he will have 1 tribe." 1 Kings 11 verses 29-31. The cloth tore in the same way the covenant had been fractured, the same way Solomon's heart had been segmented between God and Ashtoreth, between obedience and compromise, between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. 10 tribes gone, violently ripped away. But even in judgment, mercy lingered. 1 tribe would remain, Judah, not for Solomon's sake. His choices had forfeited that privilege, but for David's sake, because God had made an unbreakable promise to David, a covenant sworn in heaven. And God does not break his word, even when his people shatter theirs. The kingdom Solomon built with legendary wisdom, wealth, and peace would not survive his son. It would split violently down the middle, bleed, and war against itself for generations. Brother would fight brother. Altars to God would stand across the border from altars to Baal. And Solomon, he would live to see the prophecy spoken. He would hear about Ahijah's cloak and Jeroboam's divine call. He would know his legacy was crumbling visibly before his very eyes. But he would die before the full collapse unfolded. The question is, did he change, or did he simply wait, watching the kingdom hold together by a precarious thread, knowing the tear was already written, the judgment already sealed? The palace was full of people, but Solomon was profoundly alone. The music still played every night. The banquet still overflowed with exotic wine and delicacies from every corner of the known world. Gold still paneled the walls, reflecting the light of countless oil lamps. But somewhere in the gaping, hollow center of all that accrued glory, the king sat, visibly aging, profoundly weary, graying, surrounded by everything he ever wanted and none of what he desperately needed. He had chased it all relentlessly. Pleasure in every conceivable form, knowledge from every possible source, achievement on every grand scale, power that bent nations to his will. He built gardens that rivaled Eden, terraced and lush with every tree that pleased the eye, planted vineyards that stretched beyond sight, their grapes pressed into wine that flowed like rivers, filled his courts with musicians whose songs made queens weep and poets envious. He constructed reservoirs and aqueducts, owned flocks and herds larger than small kingdoms, accumulated silver until it became as common as rough stones in Jerusalem. He denied his eyes no spectacle they craved, refused his heart no pleasure it demanded. And at the end of it all, he looked around, truly looked, and felt nothing but a crushing void. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2. Meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Vanity of vanities, the Hebrew says, vapor, smoke, a breath that disappears the very moment you try to hold it. This was not the cry of a cynical atheist, nor the despair of someone who never knew God. This was the tragic confession of a king who had secured everything the world offered, only to discover that without the giver, it all amounted to nothing. He dissected life with the precision of a master philosopher, analyzed every pursuit, every ambition, every fleeting joy with the divine mind God had given him. He wrote of the rivers perpetually flowing into the sea, yet never managing to fill it, of generations that ceaselessly rise and fall, leaving behind no permanent impression upon the earth, and of the wind, forever circling, blowing south, turning north, spinning back again, endless, weary, and ultimately directionless. Solomon penned verses about trust, yet he had tragically forgotten how to embody it. He exhorted others to fear God, even as he spent decades compromising with his enemies, erecting their foreign altars, and smothering his own conscience under the heavy guise of diplomatic expediency. Now, in the fading light of his reign, Solomon had ceased to be a true king. He was transformed into a preacher, not the commanding figure who stood confidently in the temple, but the broken sage sitting amid the self-inflicted ruins of his own decisions, painfully crafting warnings for those who would follow, desperately hoping someone would heed the lessons he had grasped far too late. The metamorphosis was absolute, from commanding sovereign to sorrowful mourner, from the wisest man on earth to the most isolated soul dwelling in the palace. Thus, Solomon wrote again, but this time it was a visceral confession, raw, brutally honest, completely stripped of royal pretense. Ecclesiastes. The book reads like a man retracing the steps of his entire life, opening every sealed door, meticulously examining every choice, every fleeting moment he believed would bring satisfaction, only to discover them all hollow, like someone lifting the culmination of their life's toil into the sunlight and watching it dissipate into smoke. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Ecclesiastes 2 verses 10 to 11. Pause and absorb that profound declaration. This is the man who truly possessed everything. The architect of a kingdom so magnificent it literally stole the breath and composure of the Queen of Sheba. He wielded a wisdom that magnetically drew entire nations to his feet, treating him like a revered master. He lived in a state of opulence beyond most people's wildest imaginings. His ultimate verdict? I chased the wind. He confessed to spending his life grasping at thin air, tirelessly pursuing shadows, building colossal monuments to his own fleeting glory that utterly failed to fill the consuming void within his heart. Solomon finally grasped the central truth it had taken him decades to recognize. When existence revolves around what you construct rather than whom you serve, even stellar success quickly devolves into slavery. The thrill of pleasure evaporates the very instant you experience it. The sound of applause dies moments before you exit the stage. All the grand projects eventually crumble. The achievements are rapidly forgotten, and you are left standing alone in a palace overflowing with worldly treasures that have no power to soothe the chronic ache in your soul. Ecclesiastes may initially sound like the language of despair, but pay closer attention. This is profound awakening. Solomon, at the very close of his years, systematically tore away every single distraction, every superficial accomplishment, every moral compromise, and finally articulated the foundational truth he should have voiced all along, the truth he knew at Gibeon, but grievously lost sight of amid the splendor of the palace. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13. And then, in the concluding verses, Solomon penned his ultimate mandate. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of all mankind. The king who had once begged God for extraordinary wisdom concluded his life by pleading for something fundamentally simpler: obedience. The man who mastered all knowledge ended his treatise by declaring that the only thing of lasting consequence is complete surrender. Wisdom, divorced from active obedience, becomes merely well-decorated emptiness. Knowledge that resists surrender is nothing more than slavery masked by royal robes. But Solomon's story did not conclude there. Even within his comprehensive failure, even among the ruins left by his divided heart, God was persistently writing a narrative that extended far beyond Solomon's immediate mistakes. Solomon's last days were characterized by silence. No grand state ceremony marked his passing. No dramatic exit captivated the gaze of watching nations. Just an aged king seated quietly in the imposing shadow of everything he had constructed, his eyes clouded not just by age, but by the crushing weight of having seen far too much and comprehending it all far too late. He had witnessed the full spectrum of human experience and divine interaction. The cloud of glory so thick it filled the temple, causing the priests to fall to their knees, unable to breathe in the sheer presence of holiness. He had seen the Queen of Sheba bowing in astonished wonder, her voice faltering as she admitted that not even half his splendor had been reported. He had also seen the illicit altars high on the hills where his foreign wives offered incense to dark gods demanding shame and blood. He had observed the placid faces of court advisors who had long since stopped challenging him. He had registered the ominous silence of prophets who once spoke God's truth freely. He had walked closely with God only to deliberately walk away. He had experienced the dizzying heights of divine favor and the agonizing, crushing weight of divine silence. He had tasted every conceivable pleasure, only to find them all turn bitter in his mouth. Now, standing at the end, completely stripped of all self-deception and illusion, he finally reached clarity. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 29. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. Many schemes. The diplomatic marriages that sounded so pragmatic, the strategic compromises that guaranteed temporary political peace, the temples built for foreign gods disguised as necessary gestures of cultural respect. Every shrewd plan that appeared utterly sensible in the moment ultimately served only to lead him further away from the one who had first made him great. Solomon had relentlessly pursued wisdom as if it were the ultimate destination, believing that simply knowing more would somehow suffice. But wisdom was never intended to be a substitute for God. It was never meant to become an idol in and of itself. Rather, it was designed to perpetually lead him back to humility, daily reminding him of his profound need for a being far greater than himself. And in his final literary bequest, his life's wisdom did precisely that. His words were transformed into scripture, canonized and meticulously preserved, read by millions across millennia. His life was far from perfect, his reign deeply flawed, but his final repentance was undeniably genuine. In the end, he abandoned all attempts to defend himself and chose instead to speak the painful, unvarnished truth. Following his death, Solomon's kingdom shattered. 10 tribes rebelled to the north under Jeroboam, leaving only one tribe, Judah, tenuously clinging to the south, surrounded by hostile forces, a mere shadow of the glorious united kingdom it had once been. But the survival of that single remaining tribe was no accident. It was not a consolation prize or the meager scraps left behind after judgment had been rendered. It was pure, deliberate mercy. God had established an eternal covenant with David, a solemn promise spoken beneath the stars and eternally sealed in heaven, that one of his descendants would occupy the throne forever, that his royal line would never be extinguished. Through David's lineage, God intended to achieve something far beyond the capacity of any human king. Even though Solomon failed spectacularly, even though the kingdom smashed like pottery thrown against stone, even though the magnificent temple he constructed would one day be reduced to ash and the glory would irrevocably depart, God's original promise held fast. This was because the entire saga was never truly about Solomon at all. It was always about the king who would emerge from that very line centuries hence. The one who would never compromise, never drift from his purpose, never build altars to false gods, and never allow his heart to be divided between the loyalties of heaven and the temptations of earth. Where Solomon failed, Jesus Christ definitively fulfilled. Solomon erected a temple of exquisite gold and cedar that ultimately decayed and fell. Jesus built a spiritual temple made of human hearts that will never fade, never crumble, and never be destroyed. Solomon received wisdom from God merely as a gift. Jesus is the very wisdom of God, incarnate, perfect, unshakable, the Word made flesh. Solomon's glory blazed brilliantly but quickly dimmed in his own lifetime, choked by compromise and idolatry. Christ's glory will never end, never diminish, and never be shared with another entity. And here is the penetrating question that holds immediate relevance for us now, today, in this very moment. If wisdom personified could stumble, if the man who possessed absolutely everything could lose his fundamental direction, then where exactly is your own heart anchored? Is it secured in what you know, in the edifices you've built, in how blessed you appear, in the level of success you've achieved, or in the number of people who follow you? No, it must be anchored in Him, in Christ, the only one who never drifts, never compromises, and never allows his heart to be divided. And as we conclude our reflection on Solomon's tragic ending, there is another parallel story that runs alongside his, different in every detail, yet strangely carrying the identical warning. God gifted Solomon with the greatest intellect the world had ever known. He endowed Samson with a measure of physical strength no other human being had ever carried. Both men fell, not due to a lack of their respective powers, but because they neglected to guard their hearts. If Solomon's narrative has profoundly affected you, you must examine the fate of Samson. His downfall acts as a chilling mirror of this one, powerfully demonstrating how even the most extraordinary gifts completely collapse the moment your heart begins to drift from God. Be sure to watch that video next. It serves as the other half of this critical warning.